the plate shattered inches from my feet. For a second, no one moved. Not my son, not the children, not even me. Then Brittany, my daughter-in-law, looked me straight in the eye and said loud enough for everyone at that Thanksgiving table to hear, "You are the most selfish woman I've ever met." I was still holding the serving spoon, still standing in the kitchen I wasn't even supposed to host in. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. This wasn't an outburst. This was a story she had been telling about me for months, and everyone else at that table already believed it. If you've ever felt blindsided by someone you trusted, I'd really like to hear your story. Where are you watching from and what time is it there? And if this moment already hits close to home, consider liking and subscribing, because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. My name is Martha Wallace, and until that Thanksgiving, I believed I understood my family. I'm 62 years old. I've lived in the same quiet neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio for over 3 decades. My late husband Richard and I raised our only son Daniel in a modest brick house with a white porch swing and a maple tree that still turns the brightest red every fall. After Richard passed away 12 years ago, that house became both my refuge and my responsibility. I held on to it not just for myself, but for Daniel, for the memories, for the feeling that something in this world could still stay steady. Daniel and I were always close. Not in a suffocating way, at least I never thought so. We talked often, had Sunday dinners together, and I was the first person he called when something went wrong or right. When he got his first real job, when he bought his first car, when he thought he was in love. I was there for all of it. So when he told me about Brittany Collins, I was genuinely happy for him. The first time I met her, she walked into my home with a soft smile and a perfectly wrapped bottle of wine. She had long dark hair, warm brown eyes, and a kind of polished confidence that made you feel like she had everything under control. She hugged me like we already knew each other. "Martha, I've heard so much about you," she said. And I believed her. She asked thoughtful questions. She complimented my cooking. She laughed at Daniel's stories like they were the funniest things she had ever heard. If there were any warning signs, they were too subtle for me to catch at the time. Their relationship moved quickly. Within a year, they were engaged. The wedding was beautiful, small, elegant, and full of hope. I remember standing in the back of the venue watching Daniel look at her like she was the center of his world, and I thought maybe this is how it's supposed to be. Maybe my role is shifting, not ending, just changing. After the wedding, things were still good, at least on the surface. Brittany would text me occasionally, little things at first. "Daniel says you make the best chicken soup. Can you send me the recipe? Thinking about decorating for fall. What do you usually do?" Normal questions. Harmless. Even sweet. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone began to change. It started with small comments that didn't seem like much in isolation. "We're trying to build our own routines now. We just need a little space to figure things out. I think it's important for Daniel to learn to handle things on his own." There was nothing openly rude about any of it. In fact, if you repeated those words out loud, they sounded perfectly reasonable. Healthy even. But it wasn't what she said. It was how often she said it. And when. If I called Daniel in the evening, I'd sometimes hear a pause before he answered, like he was checking with someone first. If I suggested we have dinner together, Brittany would gently redirect. "This week's a little busy. Maybe next time. Daniel's really tired. He needs to rest." At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that this was just what happens when your child builds a life with someone else. That I needed to step back gracefully, not cling to the past. So I did. I stopped calling as often. I waited for invitations instead of initiating them. I told myself that love sometimes looks like distance, but the distance didn't feel natural. It felt managed. There was one moment I still remember clearly because it was the first time something inside me truly tightened. Daniel had come down with a bad flu. He sounded awful on the phone, congested, exhausted, barely able to speak. Without thinking too much about it, I made a pot of soup, packed it up, and drove over to their house. It was something I had done for him his entire life. When Brittany opened the door, her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you came," she said. "I just brought some soup for Daniel." He sounded terrible. She hesitated. "Just for a second," but it was enough. "We've got it handled," she replied. "He needs to rest." "I won't stay long," I said gently. "Just wanted to drop this off." She stepped aside eventually, but the warmth I had felt in her presence before, it wasn't there anymore. Inside, Daniel was curled up on the couch, pale and clearly miserable. When he saw me, his face softened. "Mom, you didn't have to come," he said, though his voice carried a quiet relief. "I know," I replied, setting the container down. "But I wanted to." Before I could say anything else, Brittany spoke from behind me. "We're trying not to rely on outside help for things like this," she said, her tone still calm, still polite but firm. I remember turning to her confused. "I'm not outside help, Brittany. I'm his mother." There was a brief silence. Then she smiled again, that same practiced, composed smile. "Of course. But we're a married couple now. We're building our own system." It was the word system that stayed with me, as if love had suddenly become something structured, controlled, limited. I left shortly after that. Daniel thanked me again, but there was something different in his eyes too. Not rejection, but hesitation. As if he was caught between two expectations and didn't know how to satisfy both. That was the beginning, not of a fight, not of anything loud or dramatic, but of a quiet shift. After that, every gesture I made seemed to be interpreted through a different lens. If I offered help, it was interference. If I asked questions, it was control. If I stepped back, it was distance. There was no way to be right anymore. And the hardest part wasn't Brittany. It was watching Daniel slowly adopt the language that didn't belong to him. Phrases like, "We need to establish boundaries. You have to trust us to handle our own life. I think you're too involved sometimes." Each sentence landed like a small crack in something that had once felt unbreakable. I tried to adjust. I truly did. I told myself this was part of letting go, part of raising a child who could stand on his own. But somewhere deep down, something didn't feel like growth. It felt like replacement. And I didn't yet realize it at the time, but that quiet discomfort I kept pushing aside, it was the first warning, the first sign that I wasn't just being asked to step back. I was being rewritten. Looking back now, I can see the pattern forming long before I understood what it meant. At the time, it just felt like I kept getting things wrong. Not in big, obvious ways. Not the kind of mistakes you can point to and fix with an apology. These were smaller, quieter missteps, at least that's how they were presented to me. But they added up, slowly eroding something I had always taken for granted, my place in my son's life. A few weeks after the flu incident, I tried again. Daniel had mentioned in passing that work had been overwhelming. Long hours, new responsibilities, constant pressure. I remembered those years myself when Richard was building his career and everything felt uncertain and exhausting at the same time. So one Saturday morning, I stopped by a local bakery, picked up a box of Daniel's favorite pastries, and drove over to their house. I didn't call ahead. That was my first mistake. When Brittany opened the door, her expression flickered just for a moment before settling into that same controlled smile I had started to recognize. "Martha," she said, "we weren't expecting you." "I know," I replied, holding up the box lightly. "I just thought Daniel could use a little pick-me-up." She didn't move to let me in. "We're actually in the middle of something right now." I hesitated, glancing past her shoulder. I could hear the television low voices, nothing that sounded urgent or private. "Oh, I won't stay," I said quickly. "Just wanted to drop these off." She sighed softly, not loudly enough to be rude, just enough to make her point. "Martha," she said, her tone still even. "We've talked about this. It's important for us to have our space." There it was again. Our space. As if I were an intruder instead of family. "I understand," I said, though. My voice felt thinner than I wanted it to. "I just thought—" "I know you mean well," she interrupted gently but firmly. "But sometimes it feels like you don't trust us to take care of ourselves." That sentence stayed with me long after I drove away. It wasn't just a rejection. It was a reframing. Suddenly my actions weren't acts of care. They were signs of doubt, of control, of something selfish. I began to second-guess everything after that. Every text I sent, every call I considered making, every invitation I thought about extending. I found myself hesitating in ways I never had before, asking silent questions that used to have obvious answers. Is this too much? Is this crossing a line? Am I making them uncomfortable? And then something else started to change. Daniel's voice. Not the sound of it, but the words he chose. We were on the phone one evening, just catching up. At least that's what I thought we were doing. I asked how work had been going, whether he was getting enough rest, if he and Brittany had any plans for the weekend. Normal questions, simple questions. But there was a pause before he answered. "Mom," he said carefully, "you don't have to check in on me like this all the time." I blinked, surprised. "I'm not checking in," I said. "I'm just talking to you." "I know, but—" he hesitated again. "It can feel a little overwhelming." Overwhelming. That wasn't a word Daniel had ever used with me before. "I'm sorry if it feels that way," I said quietly. "That's not my intention." I know he replied quickly. "It's just, we're trying to handle things on our own now. Brittany and I, we need to build that independence." Independence. Another new word. Another borrowed idea. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. "Of course," I said. "I want that for you too." And I meant it. I truly did. But something about the conversation left me unsettled. It wasn't just what he said. It was how rehearsed it sounded. As if he had practiced it. Or worse, been coached. A few days later, I heard something that made my heart sink even further. It came from Daniel himself, though I don't think he realized the weight of it. We were sitting in a small cafe, just the two of us, something I had suggested, carefully making sure it didn't feel like an intrusion. Brittany had a work commitment, so Daniel agreed to meet me. At first, things felt almost normal. We talked about the weather, about a movie he had seen, about nothing in particular. Then the conversation shifted. "I've been thinking about what Brittany said," he began. I felt my chest tighten slightly. "What did she say?" I asked. "That sometimes you rely on me too much." The words hit harder than I expected. "I rely on you," I repeated. He nodded, avoiding my eyes. "Not in a bad way," he added quickly. "Just emotionally. Financially sometimes." I stared at him. "Daniel, "I've never asked you for money," I said slowly. "I know," he said, "but it's not just about asking. It's about the pressure, the expectation." "What expectation?" My voice was steadier than I felt. He shifted in his seat. Like being there all the time, being available, feeling like I have to take care of you. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Take care of me. I had spent my entire life taking care of him. After Richard died, I worked longer hours. I cut back on everything that wasn't necessary. I made sure Daniel could finish college without debt, that he had a stable foundation to build his life on. And now I was the one being seen as a burden. "I don't expect that from you," I said finally, my voice quiet. "I know you don't mean to," he replied. "But sometimes it just feels that way." Feels. Another word that couldn't be argued with. Because feelings don't require proof. They just exist. And somehow my reality was being replaced by a version of events built entirely on how someone else felt about me. I nodded slowly, even though something inside me was breaking. "I'll give you more space," I said. Daniel looked relieved. "Thank you, Mom. That means a lot." That moment should have been reassuring. It should have felt like progress, but instead it felt like I had just agreed to disappear. After that conversation, I pulled back even more. I stopped dropping by. I limited my calls. I waited sometimes days, sometimes weeks for Daniel to reach out first. And when he did, the conversations were shorter, more surface level, safer. As if we were both trying not to step on invisible landmines. Then quietly another layer revealed itself. One evening, Daniel mentioned something casually that caught my attention. "Things have been a little tight lately," he said. "Just financially." I frowned. "Tight how?" "Just expenses," he replied. "Mortgage bills, everything adding up." "That happens," I said gently. "Do you need any help?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Old habits, old instincts. There was a pause. Then his voice changed, slightly tense. "No, we're fine," he said quickly. "We don't want to rely on anyone." Before I could respond, I heard Brittany's voice faintly in the background. "What did she say she asked?" Daniel lowered his voice. "Nothing," he replied. But it wasn't nothing. I could feel it. The shift, the tension, the careful management of information. Something wasn't right. They were struggling financially, that much was clear, but instead of openness, there was secrecy. Instead of support, there was distance. And instead of honesty, there was a narrative forming. One where I was no longer the mother who had supported, sacrificed, and loved, but something else, something inconvenient, something selfish. I didn't yet know how deep that narrative would go, or how many people had already heard it, but I could feel it building, like pressure beneath the surface, quiet, invisible, and waiting for the moment it would finally explode. If I had trusted my instincts more, I might have seen it sooner. But when you love someone, especially your child, you learn to question your own doubts before you question them. That's what I did when Brittany first suggested hosting Thanksgiving. It was early November when she brought it up. Daniel called me one evening, his voice unusually upbeat, almost rehearsed in its enthusiasm. "Hey, Mom," he said. "So Brittany had an idea for Thanksgiving this year." I smiled even though he couldn't see it. "Oh, what kind of idea she thinks we should host," he said. "At our place. Start our own traditions." There was a brief pause after that, as if he were waiting for my reaction. For years, decades really, Thanksgiving had been at my house. Not because I insisted, but because it had simply become the natural gathering place. After Richard passed, I kept it going. I told myself it mattered, that it kept the family connected. So yes, hearing that they wanted to host, it stung. But I didn't let that show. That sounds lovely, I said warmly. I think it's a great idea. Relief flooded his voice. Really? Of course, I replied. It's time you both made your own memories. And I meant it. Or at least I wanted to mean it. A couple of days later, Brittany called me directly. That in itself was unusual. Martha, she said, her tone light, almost overly sweet. I just wanted to go over some details for Thanksgiving. Of course, I said. What do you need? Well, she began. Since we're hosting, I want everything to feel cohesive. You know, elevated. Elevated. That word again carefully chosen, slightly sharp around the edges. I was thinking, she continued, you could bring a few dishes. Maybe you're stuffing that cranberry thing you make and the pecan pie. Of course, I said. I'd be happy to. And she added, almost as an afterthought, we're trying to do a more upscale menu this year, so the ingredients are a bit pricey. I waited. We're covering most of it, she went on, but if you could help with a few of the specialty items that would really take the pressure off. There it was. Not a direct request for money, but close enough. Just let me know what you need, I said. Perfect, she replied quickly. I'll send you a list. When the list came, I was surprised. Imported cheeses, organic herbs, a particular brand of wine I had never heard of. It was far more than what I would have considered a typical Thanksgiving meal. Still, I didn't question it. If this was their way of celebrating, I wanted to support it. So I did. I spent more than I had planned. Not recklessly, but enough to notice. Enough to feel the weight of it as I packed everything into my car the day before Thanksgiving. That same afternoon, Daniel called me again. His voice was quieter this time. Mom, he said, can I ask you something? Of course. Would you be able to help out a little more? Just for the groceries. I hesitated. I thought Brittany said you had most of it covered. We do, he said quickly. It's just things got a little more expensive than we expected. There was something in his tone, not just embarrassment, but urgency. How much do you need? I asked gently. He named a number. It wasn't small, but it also wasn't impossible. I closed my eyes for a moment. Okay, I said. I'll take care of it. Thank you, Mom. He breathed. Really? I appreciate it. Of course you do, I said softly, though he didn't hear the deeper meaning behind it. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the checkbook in front of me. Something about the situation didn't sit right. If they were struggling financially, why plan such an elaborate meal? Why insist on hosting something so expensive? But then I pushed the thought aside. They're young, I told myself. They're figuring things out. And sometimes people make choices that don't make sense to anyone else. It wasn't my place to judge. It was my place to support. At least that's what I had always believed. The next morning, I woke up early and started cooking. The familiar rhythm of Thanksgiving preparation grounded me. Chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, baking pies, it was something I could control, something that hadn't changed. For a few hours, I let myself forget the unease. By the time I packed everything into containers and loaded them into my car, the sun was just beginning to rise. As I drove to Daniel and Brittany's house, I told myself this would be a fresh start. New traditions didn't have to mean losing the old ones. Maybe this was an opportunity. Maybe I had been overthinking everything. Maybe things would feel normal again. But the moment I stepped through their front door, I knew something was off. The air felt tight. Not hostile, not yet, but strained. Like everyone was waiting for something. Brittany greeted me with a bright smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Martha, you made it," she said, her voice carrying just a little too much enthusiasm. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied. She glanced at the containers in my hands. "Oh, good, you brought everything," she said. "Just set it in the kitchen. No hug, no warmth, just direction." I nodded and moved past her, trying not to read too much into it. Inside, I saw a few familiar faces, relatives who had always attended our Thanksgivings. They smiled, waved, greeted me politely. But something felt different, subtle, hard to define. The conversations were quieter when I walked by. The smiles didn't linger. And once or twice I caught someone looking at me, then quickly looking away. It was a small thing, but it planted a seed. Had something been said? Had I missed something? I pushed the thought aside again. Don't assume I told myself. Don't create problems where there aren't any. Still, as I arranged the dishes in the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into a room where a conversation had already been happening. And I wasn't part of it. A little later, as I was setting out the plates, I overheard Brittany speaking to one of the relatives in the living room. I wasn't trying to listen, but her voice carried. I wanted to keep things simple, she was saying, but Martha insisted on bringing all these dishes. I didn't want her to feel left out. I froze. The plate in my hand suddenly felt heavier. Insisted. Left out. That wasn't what happened. I hadn't insisted on anything. She had asked. She had sent the list. I stood there perfectly still as the rest of her sentence drifted toward me. It's just... Sometimes she has a hard time letting go, Brittany added softly. There was a pause. Then a sympathetic murmur from the other person. And just like that, something shifted inside me. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to make me realize that the story being told about me wasn't the one I was living, and for the first time I began to wonder how many people in that house had already heard that version, and how many of them believed it. I wish I could say I confronted Brittany right then. I wish I had stepped into that living room, set the record straight, and told everyone exactly what had happened. But I didn't. Because when you realize people may already believe something untrue about you, your first instinct isn't always to fight. Sometimes it's to retreat, to observe, to understand just how much damage has already been done. So I stayed quiet. I finished setting the table, adjusted the silverware, straightened the napkins, small controlled movements to keep my hands steady while my thoughts spun faster than I could contain them. I told myself it might have been a misunderstanding, that maybe Brittany didn't mean it the way it sounded, that maybe I was being overly sensitive. But deep down, I knew better, because it wasn't just that one comment. It was the way the room felt around me, subtle but undeniable. A shift in temperature, a quiet distancing, people who had known me for years suddenly interacting with me like they weren't quite sure who I was anymore. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside for a moment, needing air. The November chill hit my face sharp and grounding. I stood near the edge of the porch, wrapping my coat tighter around me, trying to steady the uneasy feeling building in my chest. That's when I heard a small voice behind me. "Grandma." I turned. It was Lily, my granddaughter, 7 years old with Daniel's eyes and Brittany's dark hair. She stood there in her little sweater, clutching a stuffed rabbit, her expression hesitant. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile. "What are you doing out here?" She walked over slowly, looking up at me with a seriousness that didn't belong on a child's face. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course," I replied gently. She hesitated, then lowered her voice as if sharing a secret. "Why do you make Daddy cry about money?" For a moment, the world stopped. The sounds from inside the house faded. The cold air seemed to press in around me. I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "What did you say?" I asked softly. Lily shifted uncomfortably, hugging her rabbit closer. "Mommy said, 'You keep asking Daddy for money,'" she continued, "and that it makes him really sad, and that he doesn't know how to tell you no." Each word landed like a blow. I don't do that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head, slightly confused. "But Mommy said you do," she replied. "She said you don't realize how much pressure you put on him." Pressure. There was that word again, that same carefully constructed language, coming now from a child. I crouched down in front of her, trying to keep my expression calm even as something inside me cracked open. "Lily," I said gently, "has Daddy ever told you that himself?" She shook her head. "No, but Mommy said he feels it, and that sometimes grown-ups don't say things because they don't want to hurt people." I closed my eyes for just a second. Not because I didn't believe her, but because I did. This wasn't something Lily had come up with on her own. These were ideas that had been placed in her mind, repeated, explained, framed in a way that made me the problem. I opened my eyes again and forced a small smile. "Thank you for telling me, sweetheart," I said. "That was very honest of you," she nodded, seeming relieved. "I didn't want Daddy to be sad," she added. "I know," I said softly. "Neither do I." She hugged me then tightly and ran back inside. And I stayed there, frozen on that porch, trying to breathe through the weight of what I had just heard. Because it wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It wasn't just a comment overheard in passing. This was something deeper, something intentional. A story that had been told often enough, clearly enough, that even a 7-year-old believed it without question. I stood there for a long time, replaying everything in my mind. Every interaction, every conversation, every moment I had dismissed as small or insignificant, and suddenly they didn't feel small anymore. They felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was part of. When I went back inside, I saw things differently. I noticed how one of my cousins avoided asking me about my life, something she had always done before. I noticed how Daniel's friend, someone who used to joke easily with me, kept his distance, his tone polite but guarded. I noticed how Brittany moved through the room, smiling, hosting, controlling the flow of conversation with effortless precision. And every now and then she would glance at me, just briefly, just enough to make sure I was still contained. It wasn't obvious, it wasn't dramatic, but it was deliberate. And for the first time, I felt something shift inside me, not just hurt, not just confusion, but awareness. Clear, sharp, undeniable. This wasn't about me being too involved. This wasn't about boundaries or independence. This was about perception, about control, about who got to define the narrative and who had to live inside it. And right now, I wasn't the one telling my own story. As dinner time approached, the tension in the house grew thicker. People gathered around the table, taking their seats. Plates were passed. Glasses were filled. Laughter rose in small, careful bursts, too measured, too polite. And beneath it all, something waited. I could feel it, like the air before a storm. I sat down slowly, folding my hands in my lap for a moment before reaching for my napkin. Across the table, Brittany caught my eye, and for the briefest second, her smile slipped. Not completely, just enough. Just long enough for me to see something underneath it. Something colder. Something calculating. Then it was gone. Replaced by that same perfect, polished expression. "Everyone ready," she said brightly. Voices murmured in agreement. And as the first dishes were passed around the table, I realized something with a clarity that made my chest tighten. Whatever had been building, whatever story had been told, it hadn't reached its peak yet. That moment on the porch with Lily, that wasn't the breaking point. It was the warning. And somehow I knew. The worst part of this day was still ahead of me. By the time everyone took their seats, the house had grown quieter in a way that didn't feel natural, not peaceful, controlled. The kind of quiet that exists when people are careful about what they say and who they say it in front of. I sat midway down the table, close enough to see everyone clearly, far enough to feel like I wasn't quite part of the center anymore. The table itself was beautifully arranged, too beautifully almost. The polished silverware, the perfectly folded napkins, the imported wine bottles Brittany had mentioned. Everything looked like something out of a magazine. And yet beneath all that perfection, something was off. I noticed it in Daniel first. He sat across from me, shoulders slightly hunched, his movements slower than usual. He forced a smile when someone spoke to him, nodded when appropriate, laughed, half a second too late. It was the kind of behavior you only recognize when you've known someone your entire life. He wasn't relaxed. He was performing. Every now and then his eyes would flick toward Brittany as if checking something. Not seeking affection, seeking approval. That realization settled heavily in my chest. "Daniel, honey, could you pass the turkey?" Brittany said, her voice light but precise. He reached for it immediately, almost too quickly, nearly knocking over his glass in the process. "Careful," she added with a small laugh that didn't quite sound like a joke. A few people smiled. I didn't. Because it wasn't just the words, it was the dynamic. Subtle, but unmistakable. As dishes began to move around the table, the conversation picked up in small, safe bursts. Work updates, school stories, holiday plans, nothing too deep, nothing too personal, nothing that might disrupt the delicate balance Brittany seemed to be maintaining. I served the stuffing I had made, placing it gently onto my plate. No one commented on it. No one mentioned the dishes I had brought. Not even Daniel. That in itself felt strange. For years, my cooking had been part of these gatherings, a shared comfort, something people looked forward to. Now it was just there. Unacknowledged. Invisible. "Everything looks amazing," Brittany, one of the relatives, said. She smiled graciously. "Thank you. I really wanted to elevate things this year. Make it feel a little more intentional." Intentional. Another carefully chosen word. "I think it's important to grow," she continued. "To not stay stuck in old patterns just because they're familiar." There was a soft murmur of agreement around the table. I kept my eyes on my plate, because I knew that wasn't just a general statement. It was a message, and it was directed at me. A few minutes later, the conversation shifted subtly but unmistakably toward finances. It started innocently enough. Someone mentioned rising grocery prices. Another person joked about how expensive everything had become. Then Brittany leaned back slightly in her chair, taking a small sip of wine before speaking. "It really makes you think about priorities," she said. "About who you're supporting and how." The table quieted just a little. Not completely. but enough. I felt it, that slight shift in attention, that unspoken awareness that something was about to be said. Daniel shifted in his seat. "Brittany," he said quietly, almost as a warning, but she smiled at him, calm and composed. What she said lightly, "I'm just saying it's easy to get taken advantage of if you're not careful." My hand tightened slightly around my fork. No one spoke. No one challenged her. And that silence said more than any words could, because it wasn't just that she said it. It was that no one seemed surprised, as if this was something they had already heard before, something they had already accepted. I lifted my glass, taking a slow sip of water, giving myself a moment to think, to stay calm, to not react impulsively. But inside something was beginning to rise. Not anger, not yet, but clarity, a sharper awareness of what was happening around me. Some people, Brittany continued, her tone still smooth, still controlled, don't realize how much pressure they put on others, especially when it comes to money. There it was, no longer subtle, no longer indirect. I looked up slowly. Our eyes met, and for the first time that day, she didn't look away. "Pressure," I said, keeping my voice steady. She tilted her head slightly as if surprised I had responded. "I didn't mean anyone specific," she replied, though her gaze remained fixed on mine. "Of course you didn't." I thought. Except you did. Every single person at that table knew exactly what she meant. Because they had been told, because the story had already been planted. And now, she was reinforcing it. In public, in front of everyone. Daniel cleared his throat. "Let's just enjoy dinner," he said, his voice tight. But Brittany smiled again, that same calm, polished smile. "I'm enjoying it," she said. "I just think honesty is important in families, don't you?" No one answered. No one defended me. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. This wasn't just about Brittany's opinion. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding between two people. This was a narrative that had already been built. Carefully, quietly, repeated enough times that it had become truth, or at least something close enough to truth that no one questioned it anymore. I set my fork down gently, not out of surrender, but out of control, because reacting emotionally now would only confirm the version of me she had created, the selfish one, the pressuring one, the problem. So I did the only thing I could do in that moment. I stayed calm. I said nothing. And I watched. I watched how people avoided looking directly at me. I watched how Brittany guided the conversation back to safer topics, as if she had simply brushed against something sensitive. I watched how Daniel remained quiet, his shoulders tense, his eyes fixed on his plate. And I realized something that made my chest ache more than any accusation could have. He wasn't just silent. He was conflicted. Part of him didn't believe what was being said. I could see it, feel it. But another part of him, the part that lived with Brittany, the part that heard her voice every day, the part that had been slowly shaped by her words over time, that part was unsure. And uncertainty is dangerous because it creates space for doubt, and doubt once planted grows, even in the strongest relationships, especially in them. As the meal continued, the tension never fully disappeared. It lingered beneath every conversation, behind every polite smile, waiting, building, and I could feel it. Like something just beneath the surface. Something that hadn't been released yet, because Brittany wasn't finished. Not even close. What she had done so far, That was just preparation, setting the stage, making sure everyone saw me the way she wanted them to, so that when the moment came, when she finally said what she had been building toward, no one would question it. No one would doubt it. And worst of all, no one would defend me. I sat there surrounded by people I had known for years and felt more alone than I ever had in my life. And deep down, I knew the real explosion hadn't happened yet. But it was coming. And when it did, it wouldn't just shatter a plate. It would shatter everything I thought my family was. It happened so fast that for a moment I wasn't sure what I had just seen. 1 second, Brittany was smiling across the table, lifting her wine glass as if she were about to make a toast. The next, the plate was in the air. It left her hand with a sharp, sudden motion cutting through the space between us before crashing down just inches from where I sat. The sound was violent, ceramic shattering against hardwood fragments scattering in every direction. Someone gasped. A child cried out, and then silence. The kind that presses against your ears. The kind that makes everything feel unreal. I didn't move. I couldn't. My hands were still resting on the edge of the table, fingers lightly curled around the napkin in my lap. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat and my temples in the hollow of my chest. For a moment I thought maybe it was an accident. Maybe her hand slipped. Maybe you are the most selfish woman I've ever met. Her voice cut through the silence, clear and steady. No hesitation, no apology, no doubt. I lifted my eyes slowly to meet hers. Brittany wasn't smiling anymore. Her expression had hardened into something I had only glimpsed before in passing, but never this clearly. Cold, focused, certain. Brittany. Daniel said, his voice strained, almost pleading, but she didn't look at him. She was looking at me. You stand there acting like everything you do is out of love, she continued, her tone rising just enough to fill the room, but it's not. It's control. A murmur rippled through the table. I could feel the weight of every gaze turning toward me, waiting, judging, believing. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, my voice quiet but steady. She let out a short, humorless laugh. Of course you don't, she replied, because in your mind you're the victim. You always are. The words stung, but more than that, they unsettled me, because she wasn't speaking impulsively. She was delivering something practiced, something prepared. You've been manipulating Daniel for years, she went on, making him feel like he owes you everything, like he can't say no to you. That's not true, I said more firmly now. Isn't it? She shot back. How many times have you made him feel guilty for living his own life, for choosing his own family? I have never. You show up uninvited, she interrupted sharply. You insert yourself into everything. You make decisions that aren't yours to make, and then you act hurt when we try to set boundaries. Each accusation landed like a blow. Not because they were true, but because they sounded believable. Because they echoed the narrative she had been building all along. I brought you what you asked for, I said, gesturing lightly toward the dishes on the table. I helped because Daniel said you needed it. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not doubt. Anger. Exactly, she snapped. You always help. That's how you keep control. That's how you make sure we never feel independent. That's not helping, that's trapping. The room shifted. I could feel it. That subtle tilt in perception. That dangerous moment when people begin to question what they thought they knew. I turned to Daniel. Tell them I said quietly. Tell them I've never asked you for anything. Tell them I've only ever tried to support you. He didn't answer. He didn't even look at me. He stared down at his plate, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. "Daniel," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "Look at me." Slowly, reluctantly, he lifted his gaze, and what I saw there wasn't certainty, wasn't defense. It was confusion, doubt, conflict, and that hurt more than anything Brittany had said. "See," Brittany said softly, almost triumphantly, "he doesn't even know how to answer. That's what you've done to him." "I haven't done anything to him." I said, the words coming out sharper now. "I raised him. I supported him. I loved him. And now you can't let him go," she shot back. "I have let him go," I said. "I've stepped back more than you even realize." "Not enough," she replied coldly. A glass clinked somewhere on the table as someone shifted uncomfortably. The children were quiet now, watching with wide, frightened eyes. Lily sat frozen in her chair, her little hands gripping the edge of the table. I felt something inside me crack. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Because this wasn't just an argument. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something that had been building for a long time, and now it was being unleashed in front of everyone. "You've turned everyone against me," I said quietly, the realization settling fully into place. Brittany tilted her head. "I didn't have to," she replied. "You did that yourself." Another lie, another distortion, but it didn't matter anymore, because the damage had already been done. I could see it in the faces around the table. Some looked uncomfortable, some looked sympathetic. But none of them looked certain enough to stand up and say she was wrong. Not one. And that silence, that collective hesitation, was louder than anything Brittany had said. "I think maybe you should leave," one of the relatives said softly. The words hung in the air, directed at me. Of course they were, because in that moment I wasn't the host, I wasn't the mother, I wasn't even the guest. I was the problem. I looked at Daniel one last time, waiting, hoping for something, anything, a word, a gesture, a sign that he knew me, that he believed me, that he remembered who I had always been. But he didn't move. He didn't speak. And that was the moment everything truly broke. Not the plate, not the accusations, but that silence, that choice. I nodded slowly, not in agreement, not in acceptance, but in understanding. I picked up my purse from the chair beside me, my movements calm, controlled, almost detached. "I won't stay where I'm not wanted," I said quietly. No one stopped me. No one argued. No one followed. As I walked toward the door, I could feel their eyes on me, some filled with discomfort, some with doubt, some with something that might have been regret. But none of that mattered, because the one pair of eyes that should have mattered most had already turned away. I stepped outside into the cold evening air, the door closing behind me with a soft but final sound. And for a moment, I just stood there, breathing, trying to process what had just happened, trying to hold on to something solid in a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Because in less than an hour, I had gone from being part of that family to being cast out of it. And the worst part, I wasn't even sure when it had really started. But as I walked to my car, one thought settled in my mind with quiet, undeniable certainty. That wasn't just an argument. It was an execution of a story, of a reputation, of me. And somehow, I knew it wasn't over, not even close. I don't remember the drive home. I remember turning the key. I remember the engine starting. I remember pulling away from the curb, but everything in between felt distant, muted, like I was moving through something thick and invisible that dulled sound and slowed time. The streetlights blurred past in long streaks of gold. The radio was on, but I couldn't hear it. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, even though inside everything felt like it was unraveling. It wasn't until I pulled into my driveway that the silence hit me. Not the quiet of an empty house. The kind of silence that follows something breaking. I sat there for a long moment, the engine still running, my fingers resting on the steering wheel. Then I turned the car off. And just like that, everything came rushing in. The plate shattering, Brittany's voice, the words selfish, controlling, pressure, Daniel's face, his silence. I pressed my palms against my eyes, but it didn't stop the images. It didn't stop the feeling. That sharp, aching mix of humiliation and disbelief that settled deep in my chest. I had been accused before in my life, misunderstood even, but never like this. Never publicly, never so completely. I stepped out of the car, slowly locking it out of habit, though I wasn't thinking clearly enough to remember doing it. Inside, the house felt exactly the same as I had left it that morning. The kitchen counters clean. The dishes I hadn't used still neatly stacked. The faint smell of cinnamon from the pie I had baked lingering in the air. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I set my purse down on the table and leaned against the counter, my hands gripping the edge as if I needed something solid to hold on to. For a moment, I let myself feel it. All of it. The hurt. The anger. The confusion. The quiet, unbearable question that kept repeating in my mind. How did it get this far? Not just the argument. Not just the explosion. But the belief behind it. Because Brittany hadn't been guessing. She had been certain. Certain that what she said would be accepted. Certain that no one would challenge her. Certain that I had already been positioned. And she had been right. That was the part that hurt the most. Not what she said, but how easily it had been received. I pushed away from the counter and walked slowly into the living room, lowering myself onto the couch. My body felt heavy, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort. I sat there for a while, staring at nothing. Then gradually, something shifted. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but enough. The tears stopped. My breathing steadied, and beneath the hurt, something else began to surface. Clarity, because once the shock faded, the details started coming back, not just from tonight, from before. Conversations, moments, patterns. I stood up and walked back into the kitchen, pulling open a drawer where I kept old receipts and paperwork. If Brittany's story was true, there would be evidence. There had to be. But I already knew what I would find, because I had lived it. Still, I needed to see it, to ground myself in something real. I began sorting through envelopes, stacking them on the counter. Bank statements, check stubs, notes. I had scribbled months ago. It didn't take long, because I had never hidden anything. I found the first one easily, a transfer I had made to Daniel 6 months earlier. A smaller amount. He had told me it was for an unexpected car repair. "I'll pay you back," he had said. "You don't have to," I had replied. I remembered that conversation clearly. The hesitation in his voice. The relief. I found another one. And another. Not large sums all at once, but consistent. Quiet. Given when he asked. Never demanded. Never expected. Always offered. My hands moved faster now, pulling out more records, laying them side by side. A pattern was forming, not of me taking, but of me giving, again and again, without question, without recognition, without ever mentioning it to anyone else, because I had believed it was private, between a mother and her son. But now that privacy had been turned against me, I reached for my phone, scrolling back through old messages, Daniel's texts. Short, careful, sometimes almost hesitant. "Hey, Mom, I hate to ask, but I'll pay you back as soon as I can. Please don't tell Brittany, she's already stressed." That last message made my chest tighten. Please don't tell Brittany. Why? Why would helping him be something to hide, unless she didn't know? Or worse, unless she did know, and had chosen to twist it. I sank into a chair, my mind racing. If Brittany believed I was taking from Daniel, then she was either completely unaware of the truth, or she was deliberately ignoring it. Neither option made sense. Not fully. Not yet. I scrolled further. More messages. More requests. More reassurances. And then, something different. A message from Daniel just a few weeks ago. Mortgage is tight this month. Trying to figure it out. I frowned. Mortgage. That didn't align with what Brittany had said about their finances. She had implied they were managing things carefully, even confidently. So why would he be struggling? I leaned back slightly, the pieces beginning to shift again. Something wasn't adding up. Not just about me. About them. Their finances. Their situation. The story being told didn't match the reality I was seeing. And for the first time, a new possibility entered my mind. What if Daniel wasn't just repeating Brittany's words? What if he believed them, because he didn't know everything? What if he thought I was putting pressure on him, because he didn't realize how much I had already given? Or worse, what if he didn't know where his own money was going? That thought stopped me, cold, because it explained something I hadn't been able to understand before. The tension, the secrecy, the inconsistency, the way Brittany controlled the narrative so carefully, the way Daniel seemed unsure, like he was missing pieces of his own life. I stood up slowly, walking to the window, looking out into the dark street. The house across the road was lit warmly, normal, peaceful, unaware, and I realized something then, something that shifted everything. This wasn't just about clearing my name. This wasn't just about proving Brittany wrong. This was about truth, about understanding what was really happening beneath all of this. Because whatever Brittany had built, whatever story she had created, it wasn't just affecting me. It was affecting Daniel, their children, the entire family. And if I walked away now, if I accepted what had happened tonight and disappeared quietly, that story would become permanent, unchallenged, unquestioned. I exhaled slowly, my reflection faint in the glass. For the first time since leaving that house, I didn't feel helpless. I felt focused, not angry, not vengeful, but certain. Because I knew something now that I hadn't fully accepted before. I wasn't the problem. I had never been the problem, and if the truth had been buried, then it was time to uncover it, carefully, quietly, but completely. I turned away from the window, glancing back at the papers spread across the counter. This wasn't over, not even close. In fact, it was just beginning. The next morning, I didn't feel like the same person who had driven home the night before. The pain was still there, sharp, heavy, undeniable, but it no longer controlled me. It had settled into something quieter, something more dangerous. Focus. I woke up early, long before the sun fully rose, and made myself a cup of coffee I barely tasted. The house was still wrapped in that familiar morning silence, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt purposeful. I stood by the kitchen counter staring at the stack of papers I had organized the night before. Bank records, transfers, messages, proof. Not emotional proof. Not something that could be argued or twisted, but something factual, something real. Still, I knew that what I had in front of me was only part of the story. If Brittany had been shaping a narrative about me, then she must have been shaping other things too. And if Daniel didn't fully understand what was happening, then someone had to. I took a slow breath, then reached for my phone. There was one person I trusted to give me perspective without immediately turning it into gossip. My niece, Rachel Turner. Rachel worked at a regional bank, nothing high profile, but enough that she understood finances better than most people in our family. More importantly, she had always been level-headed, careful, discreet. If something didn't add up, she would see it. I dialed her number. She picked up on the third ring. Aunt Martha. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice warm but alert. "I need to ask you something I said. Something general." There was a pause. "Okay," she said slowly. "What's going on?" I hesitated, not because I didn't trust her, but because I wasn't ready to explain everything yet. "I just need to understand how something works," I said. "If a household has two incomes, but they're still falling behind on major bills like a mortgage, what could that mean?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. "That depends," she said finally. "Are we talking about overspending, debt mismanagement?" "All of it, maybe," I replied. She exhaled softly. "Martha, are you asking about Daniel?" I closed my eyes for a moment. "I'm asking because I'm worried," I said carefully. Another pause. Then her voice softened. "Okay," she said. "If everything looks stable on the surface but major bills aren't being paid, there are usually a few possibilities." I leaned against the counter, gripping the edge lightly. "Like what hidden debt?" she said. "Credit cards, personal loans, things that don't show up unless you're looking closely." I nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see me. "Or," I prompted, "or money is being redirected somewhere else," she continued. "Spending that one partner doesn't fully know about." My stomach tightened. Redirected how? Could be anything, she said. Online purchases, subscriptions, gambling, sending money to someone else. It's not uncommon, unfortunately. I swallowed. And if one person thinks everything is being handled, but it's not, then you get exactly what you're describing, she said. Late payments, confusion, stress, and usually a lot of blame. Blame. The word echoed in my mind. "Rachel," I said quietly, "if someone wanted to hide that, would it be easy?" "Easier than you'd think," she replied, "especially if one person controls the accounts or manages the bills. If the other person isn't actively checking, they might not notice until it's too late." Too late. I glanced at the papers on the counter, the transfers, the messages, the inconsistencies. "Thank you," I said softly. "Martha," she added gently, "if this is about Daniel, be careful. These situations can get complicated fast." I know I replied, but the truth was, I didn't know how complicated it already was. After I hung up, I stood there for a long time letting her words settle. Hidden debt, redirected money, control. It all fit. Too well. But I still needed more, because assumptions, even logical ones, weren't enough. I needed confirmation, something concrete, something that couldn't be denied. That's when I thought of someone else. Marcus Reed, Daniel's college friend. They had stayed close over the years, even after life took them in different directions. Marcus had always been straightforward, sometimes blunt but honest. If Daniel had been struggling financially, Marcus might know. I hesitated before calling him, not because I doubted him, but because I knew this step would take me further into something I couldn't easily step back from. Still, I pressed dial. "Hey, Mrs. Wallace." Marcus answered, sounding surprised. "Everything okay?" "Hi, Marcus," I said. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "No, not at all," he replied. "What's going on?" I chose my words carefully. "I wanted to ask you something about Daniel," I said, "and I need you to be honest with me." There was a brief pause. "That doesn't sound good," he said. "It might not be," I admitted. Another pause. Then his tone shifted, more serious now. "What do you need to know?" I took a breath. "Has Daniel, borrowed money from you recently?" Silence. "Not long, but long enough." "Why are you asking that?" Marcus said cautiously. "Because I need to understand what's happening," I replied. He exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he said finally. "He has." My chest tightened. "How many times?" "A few," he admitted. "Nothing crazy at first. Just small amounts." At first I repeated. "Yeah," he said. Then it got more frequent. I closed my eyes. "Did he say what it was for?" Bills Marcus replied. "Mortgage mostly. He said things were tight and he didn't want Brittany to stress about it." That detail hit me hard. He didn't want Brittany to stress, I echoed. "Yeah," Marcus said. He made it sound like he was trying to handle things himself. I leaned back against the counter, my mind racing. "So he thinks he's protecting her," I murmured. "Sounds like it," Marcus said. I hesitated, then asked the question that had been building in my mind since the night before. "Marcus, did he ever mention where all his money is going?" There was a longer pause this time. "He said Brittany handles most of the finances." Marcus replied slowly. "Why?" "Because that was the missing piece. Control. If Brittany controlled the finances, if Daniel trusted her to manage everything, then he wouldn't see the full picture. He wouldn't know." "Has he ever seemed confused?" I asked. "Like things didn't add up?" Marcus let out a short, uneasy laugh. More than once, he admitted, but every time he brushed it off. Said he probably just miscalculated something, or someone had made him think he did. "Marcus," I said quietly, "I think something's wrong." "Yeah," he replied. I was starting to think that too. After we hung up, I stood there in silence. Everything was lining up now. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to see the outline of something much bigger than I had first imagined. Brittany wasn't just controlling the narrative about me, she was controlling the narrative about everything, the finances, the stress, the blame. She had created a version of reality where Daniel believed he was struggling because of outside pressure. The family believed I was the source of that pressure, and no one questioned where the money was actually going. It was calculated, layered, carefully maintained, and the Thanksgiving explosion that hadn't been spontaneous, it had been strategic, a way to reinforce the story, to isolate Daniel further, to make sure that when things eventually fell apart, there would already be someone to blame. Me. I looked down at my hands still resting on the counter. They were steady now, no shaking, no hesitation, because the confusion was gone, replaced by something clearer, stronger, determination. This wasn't just about defending myself anymore. It was about uncovering the truth. For Daniel, for those children, for the family that had already started to drift based on something that wasn't real. And I knew one thing for certain now: Brittany had built this carefully, but she hadn't expected anyone to look closely, and I was about to. Daniel showed up 3 days later. He didn't call ahead. He didn't text. I heard the knock just after sunset, 2 short, uneven taps that didn't sound like the confident rhythm I was used to. When I opened the door, he was standing there with his hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, like he wasn't sure whether he should be there at all. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Hi, Mom," he said finally. "Hi," I replied, stepping aside. "Come in." He walked in slowly, glancing around the house, as if something might have changed since the last time he'd been there. But everything was exactly the same. It always was. I closed the door behind him and led the way into the living room. He sat on the edge of the couch, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. Nervous. That was the first thing I noticed. Daniel had never been nervous around me before. "Do you want coffee?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, I'm good." Silence settled between us again. Heavy, uncertain. Then he exhaled slowly, like he had been holding something in for too long. "I shouldn't have let it go that far," he said. I didn't ask what he meant. I knew. "Thanksgiving," he added quietly. I nodded. "You should have said something," I replied. I know he said quickly, I didn't expect her to." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "I didn't expect that." "No," I said. "Neither did I." Another pause. He looked down at his hands again, his fingers tightening together. "Brittany's been under a lot of stress," he said. There it was. The first defense. The first attempt to explain. I didn't interrupt him. "Things have been hard," he continued. "Financially, emotionally, everything." "I understand stress," I said calmly. "I don't understand throwing a plate at someone and accusing them of things that aren't true." He flinched slightly. "I'm not saying it was okay," he said quickly. "I'm just saying it didn't come out of nowhere." I studied his face, the tension, the uncertainty, the way his words sounded like they were still forming as he spoke them. "What do you think it came from?" I asked. He hesitated. Then he looked up at me. "Mom, have you ever thought that maybe you don't realize how much pressure you put on us?" The words were softer this time, less accusatory, but they were still the same words, the same narrative. "I've thought about it a lot," I said, "especially recently." He nodded like that confirmed something for him. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he added, "but sometimes it feels like you expect me to always be there, to always help, to always take care of me." I finished. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. I leaned back slightly in my chair, taking a slow breath. "Daniel," I said, my voice steady, "how many times have I asked you for money?" He frowned. "That's not what I mean. It's a simple question," I said gently. "How many times have I asked you for money?" He looked away. "I don't keep track of things like that." "I do," I replied. That got his attention. He looked back at me, confusion flickering across his face. I went through my records. I continued. Every transfer, every message, every conversation. His expression shifted from confusion to something closer to unease. And do you know what I found? I asked. He didn't answer. I found that I have never asked you for money, I said. Not once. His jaw tightened slightly. I found that every time money was exchanged between us, I continued, it was because you asked me. Silence. Thick. Unavoidable. His hands loosened slightly, his fingers no longer gripping each other as tightly. That's not how it feels, he said quietly. Feel. Again. That may be true, I said, but feelings aren't facts. He flinched again, more noticeably this time. Mom. No, I said softly, not raising my voice but holding my ground. You came here because something doesn't make sense to you. I can see that. So let's talk about what actually happened, not just how it felt. He leaned back slightly like he needed space. Okay, he said cautiously. You told me a few weeks ago that things were tight. I continued, that the mortgage was difficult to manage. He nodded slowly. It is, he admitted. And you asked me for help, I said. Another nod. Yes. And I gave it, I added. Yes. I let that settle for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been building in my mind since the night I sat at that kitchen counter. Daniel, where is your money going? He blinked. What you're working, I said. You have a steady income. You've borrowed money from me from others. His expression changed. From others? He repeated. I held his gaze. Marcus told me you've asked him for help more than once. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then something in his face shifted. Not anger, not defensiveness. Something else? Recognition. You talked to Marcus, he asked. I needed to understand, I replied. He leaned back fully now, running a hand through his hair. I didn't want anyone to know about that, he muttered. I didn't want to know either, I said. But here we are. He exhaled sharply. It's just been complicated, he said. Then help me understand, I replied. He hesitated, for longer this time, and I could see it happening, the internal conflict, the part of him that wanted to protect Brittany, the part of him that wanted to maintain the version of reality he had been living in, and the part of him that was starting to question it. I thought everything was being handled, he said finally. Bills payments. Brittany takes care of most of that. I nodded slowly. And you never checked, I asked. I trusted her, he said, a defensive edge creeping back into his voice. I'm not questioning your trust, I replied. I'm asking about your awareness. He didn't answer, because he didn't have one. You said the mortgage is behind, I continued. How far behind? He looked down again. A couple of months, he admitted. My stomach tightened, and you didn't know until recently. He shook his head. No. I thought it was paid. There it was. The gap. The missing piece. Daniel, I said carefully, if your income is steady, and the mortgage isn't being paid, and you're borrowing money to cover basic expenses. I let the sentence hang, unfinished, because he needed to reach the conclusion himself. His breathing slowed. His eyes unfocused slightly like he was replaying something in his mind. Brittany said things were just tight, he murmured. Does that explanation still make sense to you? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. But I saw it. That moment, when doubt stopped being a distant possibility and became something real, something undeniable. "I don't know," he said quietly. And for the first time since he walked through that door, he sounded honest, not rehearsed, not guided, just unsure. And that uncertainty, that was the beginning. Because once doubt enters, the truth doesn't stay hidden for long. Daniel didn't leave right away. He stayed sitting there, his body still, but his mind clearly racing somewhere far beyond the walls of my living room. I didn't push him. I didn't fill the silence. Some truths need space to rise on their own. After a while, he leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "There are things I didn't question," he said slowly, "because I didn't want to." I watched him carefully. What kind of things, I asked. He let out a long breath. "Charges," he said, "small at first, then bigger. I'd see something on the account and ask Brittany about it, and she'd always have an explanation." "What kind of explanation?" "Subscriptions. Gifts. Bills I forgot about," he replied. "Stuff that sounded reasonable if you didn't look too closely." "And you didn't look closely," I said gently. He shook his head. "No," he admitted, "because every time I brought it up, she'd get upset. Not angry exactly, more like hurt." I knew that tone. "That tactic. So you stopped asking," I said. He nodded. "I didn't want to make her feel like I didn't trust her," he added. Trust. It had been used against both of us in different ways. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, grabbing the folder I had put together the night before. When I returned, I set it down on the coffee table in front of him. "What's this?" he asked. "Look," I said. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside were the records I had organized: bank transfers, copies of checks, printed messages. Everything clear. Everything simple. He scanned the first page, then the next. His expression shifted with each one. Confusion, recognition, then something heavier. "This is..." He started trailing off. "This is every time you asked me for help," I said. He swallowed. I didn't realize it was this much, he admitted. "I didn't either," I said quietly. Not until I saw it all together. He kept flipping through the pages slower now, more carefully. "These were all for bills," he murmured. "Or at least, I thought they were." I didn't respond, because that was the part he needed to confront on his own. He reached the end of the stack and sat there staring at the last page for a long moment. Then he looked up at me. "Mom?" He said, his voice unsteady. "If this money didn't go to bills, then where did it go?" That was the question. The real one. The one everything else had been leading toward. "I think you already know the possibilities," I said. He leaned back, running a hand over his face. "I don't want to believe it," he said. "I didn't want to believe any of this either," I replied. He sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was active, processing, connecting, rebuilding a picture that had been carefully distorted over time. "There's more," he said suddenly. I waited. "There were times when Brittany would say we couldn't afford something," he continued. "Something small, dinner out, a trip, even things for the kids." I frowned, but at the same time, she'd show up with something new. "What kind of things?" I asked. "Clothes, bags, sometimes things she said were on sale," he replied. I didn't think much of it at first. People shop. That's normal. "Of course," I said, but it started to feel Inconsistent, he added. Like we were broke one day and fine the next. That matched what I had seen. The expensive dining set, the unpaid bills, the contradictions. Did you ever look at the accounts directly, I asked? He hesitated. Not really, he admitted. She handled most of it. Said it was easier that way. Easier. For whom? And the credit cards I pressed. He shook his head. I only know about the main one, he said. The one we both use. Only one I asked. I think so, he replied, though his voice lacked certainty. I watched his expression carefully. That uncertainty was growing, expanding, pushing against the edges of everything he thought he knew. There might be others, I said gently. He looked at me sharply. What do you mean? I mean, accounts you don't know about, I replied. Debt you haven't seen. Spending that hasn't been explained. He shook his head immediately. No, Brittany wouldn't. He stopped himself. Because now... He wasn't so sure. I don't know, he said finally, his voice quieter. And that was the truth. Not certainty, not denial, but doubt. Real, undeniable doubt. We sat in silence for a moment longer. Then I asked the question I had been holding back. Daniel, has Brittany ever sent money to anyone? He frowned. What do you mean? Anyone outside your household, I clarified. Friends, family, someone else. He hesitated again. Then something flickered across his face. A memory. There was someone, he said slowly. My chest tightened. Who? She said it was. A friend, he replied. Someone going through a hard time. She didn't want to talk about it much. How often, I asked. I don't know, he said. A few times, I think. Did you ever see how much? He shook his head. No, of course not. Because he hadn't been looking. Because he had trusted her to manage everything. Because the narrative had never required him to question her. Only me. I leaned back slightly, taking in everything he had said. The pieces were clearer now, not complete, but enough to form a pattern. Brittany had control over the finances, over the information, over the perception. She had created a system where Daniel believed they were struggling because of external pressure. The family believed I was the source of that pressure, and any inconsistencies were explained away before they could be examined too closely. It was effective, carefully constructed, and deeply damaging. She said I was selfish, I said quietly. Daniel looked at me. I know, he said. She said I was manipulating you, I continued. He swallowed. I know. I held his gaze. Do you still believe that? The question hung between us, heavy, unavoidable. He didn't answer right away. He looked down at the folder again, at the records, at the evidence, at the reality that no longer matched the story he had been told. I don't know what to believe anymore, he said finally. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was the honest one. And right now, honesty mattered more than anything else, because it meant the illusion was breaking, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. I nodded. That's a start, I said. He looked up at me, something new in his expression. Not just doubt, not just confusion, but a growing awareness that something had gone very, very wrong. What do we do now? He asked. I took a slow breath, because this was the moment where everything could change, or fall apart even further. We find the truth, I said. All of it." He nodded slowly, and for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt like I wasn't standing alone anymore. We didn't rush into anything. That was the first decision Daniel and I made together. Not out of hesitation, but out of understanding. Whatever Brittany had built, it hadn't been done in a single moment. It had taken time, repetition, careful control. And if we were going to uncover the truth without giving her the chance to twist it again, we needed to be just as deliberate. "Let me talk to her first," Daniel said. I studied him. "Alone?" I asked. He nodded. "I need to see how she responds when it's just us," he said. "If I go in accusing her, she'll shut down. Or turn it around." He wasn't wrong. Brittany had shown exactly how she handled confrontation: deflect, redirect, reshape. "Okay," I said, "but you don't go in blind." He glanced at the folder on the table. "I won't," he replied. 2 days later, he called me. "I need you there," he said. Something in his voice told me everything. Not panic, not anger, finality. So I went. The house looked exactly as it had on Thanksgiving. Clean, carefully arranged, perfect on the surface. But now I could see past it. Daniel opened the door before I even knocked. His face was tight controlled, but his eyes gave him away. He had already started pulling at the threads, and what he found had shaken him. "She's in the living room," he said quietly. I stepped inside. Brittany was sitting on the couch, her posture composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. If someone had walked in without knowing anything, they would have thought she was simply waiting for a conversation. Calm, prepared, in control. She looked up as I entered. There was no surprise in her expression, no discomfort, just that same measured composure. "Martha," she said, her tone polite. "I didn't expect you." "No," I replied. "I imagine you didn't." Daniel remained standing near the doorway, not sitting beside her, not moving to bridge the space between us. That in itself was new. "We need to talk," he said. Brittany gave a small, almost amused smile. I figured she replied, "You've been acting distant." Distant. The word landed differently now. Because this time Daniel didn't soften in response to it. He stepped forward and placed a stack of printed statements on the coffee table. I went through the accounts, he said. The smile didn't disappear, but it changed. Just slightly. Tighter. "What accounts?" she asked. "All of them," he replied. Silence. Brief. Sharp. Then she leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "Okay," she said calmly. "And what exactly do you think you found?" That question wasn't defensive. It was strategic. A way to measure how much he knew. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled out a few pages and laid them flat on the table. "These are credit cards I didn't know existed," he said. Brittany's eyes flicked down just for a second, then back up. "They're in my name," she said. I didn't think it was necessary to go over every detail. "Necessary," Daniel repeated. "They're for household expenses," she added smoothly, "things you didn't have time to deal with." I watched her carefully. The confidence, the control, the way she framed everything as reasonable, even when it wasn't. Daniel picked up another page. "Then why are they maxed out?" he asked. A pause. Not long. But enough. "Things got out of hand," she said. "It happens." "That's not an answer," he replied. Her expression tightened slightly. "It is an answer," she said. "Just not one you like." I could feel the tension rising, but Daniel didn't raise his voice, didn't lose control, and that was what made this different. He wasn't reacting emotionally, he was holding the line. What about the transfers, he asked next. Which ones, she replied. The ones to accounts I don't recognize. This time the pause was longer, and for the first time, there was a crack. Small, but visible. They were for a friend, she said. I know, Daniel replied. You told me that before. Then why are we talking about it again? She asked. Because the amounts don't match the story, he said. Silence again. He placed another sheet down. These are not occasional help, he continued. These are consistent payments. Brittany's jaw tightened. She needed help, she said. For months he pressed. She was in a bad situation. Brittany snapped her composure, slipping just slightly. And you didn't think to tell me, he asked. I didn't think you'd understand, she shot back. There's a lot I don't understand right now, he said quietly. That line hung in the air, heavy, unavoidable. For a moment no one spoke. Then Brittany stood up, slowly, deliberately. I think what you don't understand, she said, her voice cooling again, is how much pressure I've been under. There it was, the shift, from explanation to deflection. To manage everything, she continued. The house, the kids, the finances. While you were too busy or too trusting to pay attention, Daniel didn't react, didn't argue. He just watched her. And now she added, her eyes flicking briefly toward me. Suddenly, I'm the villain. No one answered. Because this time, the framing wasn't working. Not the way it had before. Daniel stepped forward again. This isn't about pressure, he said. This is about truth. She let out a short, sharp laugh. Truth, she repeated. You want to talk about truth? Her gaze locked onto me. Let's talk about how your mother has been manipulating you your entire life, she said. There it was. The pivot. Back to me. Back to the narrative she had built. But this time, something was different. Daniel didn't follow her. He didn't turn toward me. He didn't let her redirect the conversation. We're not talking about my mother, he said. Yes, we are, she snapped. Because she's part of this. She's always been part of this. No, he said firmly. You made her part of it. Silence. Sharp. Immediate. And for the first time, Brittany didn't have a response ready. Her composure cracked, not completely, but enough. Her shoulders tensed. Her eyes hardened. You really think she's innocent in all of this? She asked. I think you've been lying, Daniel replied. The words landed like a blow. Clear. Direct. Unavoidable. For a second, Brittany just stared at him. Then something shifted. Not confusion. Not denial. But something deeper. Something darker. And when she spoke again, the mask was gone. I did what I had to do, she said. The room went still. What does that mean? Daniel asked. Her lips pressed together, then parted again. You don't know what it's like, she said, her voice lower now, stripped of its earlier polish. Walking into a family where someone else already holds all the power, all the loyalty, all the love. Her eyes flicked toward me again. I was always second, she continued, no matter what I did. That's not true, I said quietly. Don't, she snapped. Don't pretend you didn't know exactly what you were doing. You didn't have to, she cut in. It was already there. The way he looks at you, the way everyone revolves around you. Her voice rose now, emotion breaking through. I was invisible, she said. In my own marriage. Daniel stared at her. That's what this is about, he asked. It's about control, she replied. And I wasn't going to live my whole life feeling like an outsider. So you made her the enemy, he said. I made things clear, she corrected. You lied, he said again. Silence. Heavy. Final. And this time, she didn't deny it. The silence that followed her words felt heavier than anything that had come before. Not loud, not chaotic, but absolute. Because once a truth is spoken, once it steps fully into the room, it changes everything around it. Daniel didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just stood there staring at Brittany as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. You lied, he repeated. But this time, it wasn't a question. It was a conclusion. Brittany didn't respond. Not immediately. Her shoulders were still tense, her breathing shallow, but the fight had shifted. It wasn't about defending a narrative anymore. That part was over. Now it was something else. Something closer to exposure. I did what I needed to do, she said finally, her voice quieter but still firm. You weren't going to change anything otherwise. Daniel let out a slow breath. What exactly did you want to change? He asked. She looked at him, then really looked at him, and for a brief moment something like vulnerability flickered in her eyes. I wanted a life where I came first, she said. You already did, he replied. No, she said sharply. I didn't. Her gaze shifted to me again. She was always there, Brittany continued. Every decision, every conversation, every part of our life she was in it. I stepped back. I said softly. You think that was enough? Brittany snapped. You think a few less phone calls makes you less present, less influential. Her words were cutting, but beneath them I could hear something else. Not just anger, resentment. Deep, unresolved resentment. I wasn't trying to control anything I said. You didn't have to try, she replied. It was already built in. Daniel shook his head slowly. So instead of talking about it, he said, you decided to destroy her reputation. I told the truth as I saw it, Brittany insisted. You created a version of her that made you feel justified, he corrected. That landed. Hard. Because this time, there was no hesitation in his voice. No uncertainty. Just clarity. Brittany's expression tightened again. You don't understand what it felt like, she said. Being compared. Being judged. Feeling like I had to compete for my own husband's attention. You were never competing, Daniel said. That's easy for you to say, she replied. You were the one in the middle. You got both sides. I didn't. And this was your solution, he asked. Lying. Hiding money. Turning everyone against her. She didn't answer right away, because there wasn't a good answer. There were things you didn't see, she said instead. Things I had to deal with. Like what Daniel pressed. Like the pressure, she said. The expectations. The constant presence of someone who never really let go. I took a slow breath. Brittany, I said, keeping my voice calm. I would have listened if you had come to me. She laughed short, bitter. No, you wouldn't have, she said. You don't know that, I replied. I know exactly what would have happened, she shot back. You would have smiled, apologized, and then kept doing exactly what you were doing. Her words were sharp, but they weren't entirely baseless. And I knew that. Not because I agreed with her version of events, But because I understood something I hadn't fully admitted before, I had believed I was helping, supporting, being present. But I hadn't always asked if that presence was welcome. And in that space, something had grown. Not just misunderstanding, but resentment. I should have listened more, I said quietly. Both of them looked at me, surprised. I should have asked what you needed instead of assuming I continued. And for that, I'm sorry. The room went still again, because that wasn't what Brittany expected. Not defensiveness, not denial, but acknowledgement. And for a moment, she didn't know what to do with it. Daniel glanced at me, something softening in his expression. But Brittany... She shook her head. That doesn't change what you did, she said. No, I replied. But it also doesn't justify what you did. That line drew a clear boundary. Not angry, not aggressive, but firm. Daniel stepped forward again. This isn't about small misunderstandings, he said. This is about deception. Brittany's eyes flashed. I was trying to fix something that wasn't working, she said. You made it worse, he replied. I made it visible, she insisted, at the cost of everything else he said. Silence again. But this time, it felt different. Not tense. Settled, because the truth was no longer hidden. It was out, clear, undeniable. And now, it had consequences. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I can't do this, he said. Brittany stiffened. Can't do what she asked. Keep living in something that isn't real, he replied. Her expression shifted quickly now, unpredictably, from anger to something closer to fear. You're overreacting, she said. We can fix this. Fix what he asked. The lies. The debt. The way you turned my family against each other. I was trying to protect us, she said. From what he asked, she didn't answer, because there was no longer anything to hide behind. I think you need to leave, he said finally. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Finality. Brittany stared at him. You're serious, she said. Yes, you're choosing her over me, she added, her voice rising again. No, he said. I'm choosing the truth. That was the difference. And for the first time, the roles were clear. Not mother versus wife. Not loyalty versus betrayal. But truth versus deception. Brittany let out a sharp breath, her composure finally breaking completely. This is a mistake, she said. You're going to regret this. Maybe he replied, but I can't ignore it. She looked at him for a long moment, then at me, and whatever she saw, it wasn't what she expected, because there was no anger in my expression, no triumph, just clarity, and perhaps that unsettled her more than anything else. She grabbed her bag from the side of the couch, her movements sharp now, controlled only by force of habit. This isn't over, she said as she moved toward the door. No one responded, because some endings don't need arguments. They just happen. The door closed behind her with a soft final sound, and the house felt different immediately. Not lighter, not yet, but clearer, like something heavy had finally been removed, even if the damage it caused was still there. Daniel stood in the middle of the room, unmoving. Then slowly he sat down, his shoulders dropping as the weight of everything settled in. I should have seen it sooner, he said quietly. I walked over and sat across from him. We both should have seen things sooner, I replied. He looked up at me, and for the first time in a long time, there was no doubt in his eyes, just understanding and regret. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. I nodded. I know I replied. And in that moment, the anger I could have held on to, the resentment I could have fed, didn't feel as important as something else. Something quieter, but stronger. The chance to rebuild. Not what we had before, but something more honest, more aware, more real. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't just break things. It gives you a chance to rebuild them the right way. The days after Brittany left felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, not yet, but different. Like the house itself was adjusting to a new reality, one where everything that had been hidden was now out in the open, and nothing could go back to the way it was before. Daniel stayed at the house for the first few nights. Not because he didn't have somewhere else to go, but because I think he didn't trust himself to be alone with his thoughts just yet. There's something about the aftermath of truth that people don't talk about enough. They think the moment of revelation is the hardest part. It isn't. The hardest part is what comes after. The silence, the replaying, the realization that the life you thought you understood wasn't entirely real. I saw all of that in Daniel, in the way he moved through the rooms more slowly, in the way he checked things, accounts, messages, statements with a kind of urgency that bordered on disbelief, in the way he sat at the kitchen table late at night staring at numbers that suddenly meant something very different. "I should have known," he said one evening, his voice low as he flipped through another stack of papers. "You trusted someone you loved," I replied. "That's not the same as being careless." He shook his head. "It wasn't just trust," he said. "It was avoidance." I didn't interrupt. "Every time something didn't make sense, I let it go," he continued, "because it was easier than digging into it." "That's human," I said gently. "No," he replied. "It's convenient." There was no self-pity in his voice, just clarity, and that I realized was part of the healing process too. Not just seeing what someone else did, but understanding your own role in allowing it to continue. A few days later, he made the call he had been avoiding. To the mortgage company. I sat across from him while he spoke, not listening to every word but watching his face, watching the realization settle deeper. "Yes, I understand," he said quietly into the phone. "No, I wasn't aware it was that far behind." A pause. "I'll take care of it," he added. When he hung up, he didn't say anything right away. He just sat there, processing. "How bad is it?" I asked, finally. He let out a breath. "Worse than I thought," he admitted, "but not unfixable." That word mattered. Not unfixable. Because for a while, everything had felt broken beyond repair. Not just financially, but emotionally, relationally. And yet, here we were, still talking, still trying, still choosing to face things instead of running from them. Over the next few weeks, Daniel began putting things back together. Not quickly, not perfectly, but steadily. He met with a financial advisor. He closed accounts Brittany had opened without his knowledge. He started tracking every expense, every payment, every decision. And for the first time in a long time, he understood his own life. Really understood it. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of it all hit him hard, when the realization of how much had been hidden and how long it had gone on felt overwhelming. "I feel like I've been living someone else's life," he said one night. I nodded. "In a way, you have," I replied. He looked at me, a flicker of something softer in his eyes. "I don't want to do that anymore," he said. And I believed him. Because change, real change, doesn't come from guilt. It comes from awareness. From a willingness to see things clearly even when it's uncomfortable. The children were the hardest part. Lily and her younger brother Ethan didn't understand everything that had happened. They weren't supposed to. But they felt it. The tension, the absence, the shift in routine. At first, Lily was quiet around me. Not distant, but uncertain. As if she wasn't sure how to reconcile the version of me she had been told about with the person sitting in front of her. One afternoon, she came into the kitchen while I was baking. She stood there for a moment watching me, her small hands clasped in front of her. "Grandma," she said softly. I turned. "Yes, sweetheart." She hesitated, then asked, "Did you really make Daddy sad?" The question was simple, but it carried so much of what had been said, so much of what she had absorbed. I set the spoon down and crouched in front of her just like I had on that porch. "Sometimes people feel sad for reasons that are hard to understand," I said gently. "But I have never tried to hurt your daddy. Ever." She studied my face carefully, as if searching for something. Truth. Consistency. Safety. Then she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. And just like that, something small but important shifted. Trust doesn't rebuild all at once. It returns in moments, quiet ones, honest ones, moments where words and actions align. Daniel began talking to them more openly too, not about everything, but enough to reassure them, enough to create stability where confusion had been. "I made some mistakes," I heard him tell Lily one evening, "but I'm fixing them," and that mattered. Because children don't need perfection. They need honesty. They need to see that problems can be faced, not hidden. As for me, I had my own work to do because Brittany had been wrong in many ways, but not in everything. There were things I needed to face too, ways I had assumed instead of asked, moments where I had stepped in without considering whether I was stepping over, not because I wanted control, but because I believed I was helping. And sometimes, those two things can look the same from the outside. "I should have listened more," I said to Daniel one afternoon. He shook his head. "You shouldn't have had to fight for your place in your own family," he replied. "That's not what I mean," I said. "I mean, I should have been more aware of how my presence felt. Not just what it was intended to be." He considered that, then nodded slowly. Maybe we both needed to learn that, he said. And that was the truth. Healing wasn't about assigning all the blame to one person. It was about understanding the full picture, even the parts that were uncomfortable. Weeks passed, then months, and slowly, the house didn't just feel different. It felt real. No performance, no hidden narratives, no carefully managed perceptions, just honesty, sometimes messy, sometimes difficult, but real. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen baking again this time with Lily beside me, carefully measuring flour with more focus than accuracy, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief, not exactly, but peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from knowing the truth is no longer buried, and whatever comes next will be built on something solid, something honest, something that doesn't need to be protected by silence, because silence was what allowed everything to break in the first place. And now, we were finally learning how to live without it. A year later, Thanksgiving came again. For a long time, I wasn't sure we would celebrate it at all. Not because we didn't want to, but because the memory of the last one still lingered in ways that were hard to ignore. The sound of that plate shattering, the words that followed, the silence that came after. Those things don't disappear overnight. They settle, they echo, and sometimes they resurface when you least expect them. But time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges if you let it. This year the invitation was simple. No grand announcements, no elaborate plans, just a quiet conversation between Daniel and me. We should do something, he said one afternoon, standing in my kitchen, hands resting lightly on the counter. Not big, just us. I looked at him for a moment. Are you sure I asked? He nodded. Yeah, he said. I think we're ready. And I believed him, because this wasn't about recreating what we had before. It was about building something new, something honest, something that didn't rely on appearances or expectations. So we kept it small. Just the immediate family, Daniel, the kids, and me. No extended relatives, no pressure, no performance. The morning of Thanksgiving felt different from the start. Calmer, lighter. There was no rush to impress anyone. No need to prove anything. Just the quiet rhythm of preparation. I woke up early as I always did and started cooking, but this time I wasn't alone. Lily joined me in the kitchen, still in her pajamas, her hair slightly messy, her expression focused as she carefully stirred a bowl of batter. Am I doing it right? She asked. You're doing it perfectly, I replied. She smiled. Not the hesitant, uncertain smile from months ago, but a genuine one. Easy, comfortable. That alone made everything worth it. Daniel came in a little later carrying a tray of groceries. Where do you want these? He asked. On the counter is fine, I said. He set them down, then paused, looking around the kitchen. You know, he said, I used to think this place felt too familiar. I raised an eyebrow. And now, he smiled slightly. Now it feels like home again. That word settled warmly in the room. Home. Not a location, not a tradition, but a feeling. And for the first time in a long time, we all shared it. The afternoon passed quietly, cooking, talking, small moments that didn't need to be big to matter. Ethan helped set the table carefully, placing each fork and spoon with more concentration than necessary. Lily insisted on arranging the napkins even though they didn't match perfectly. And Daniel stayed present, not distracted, not distant. Just there, fully. When we finally sat down to eat, there was no tension, no underlying current of unease. Just a simple, honest moment. This looks amazing, Daniel said, glancing around the table. It's not about how it looks, I replied. He nodded. I know. And he did. We said a quiet grace, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. Not for perfection, but for progress. For truth. For the chance to sit together without pretending. As we ate, the conversation flowed naturally. Stories, laughter, small disagreements about which dish was best. Nothing forced, nothing staged. Just real. At one point, Lily looked up from her plate. Grandma, she said. Yes, sweetheart. I like this Thanksgiving better, she said simply. I smiled. Me too, I replied. And I meant it, because this one wasn't built on appearances. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It wasn't about control. It was about connection. After dinner, we moved into the living room. The kids played quietly, their laughter filling the space in a way that felt natural, not fragile. Daniel sat across from me, a cup of coffee in his hands. For a moment, we just sat there. No need to fill the silence. Then he spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about last year," he said. I nodded. "So have I." He looked down at his cup. "I can't believe I didn't see it," he said. "You see it now," I replied. "That doesn't change what happened," he said. "No," I agreed, "but it changes what happens next." He looked up at me then, and there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. Not just understanding, but respect. "I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. "I know," I said, and I'm not just saying that, he continued. "I really mean it. I let things go because it was easier, because I didn't want to deal with conflict, and that cost us both." I nodded slowly. "It did," I said. He exhaled. "But I won't do that again," he added. And I believed him, not because of the words, but because of everything that had led up to them. The choices, the effort, the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. That's what builds trust. Not promises, but actions. "I won't either," I said. He looked at me surprised. "What do you mean I won't stay silent when something feels wrong?" I explained. "Even if it's uncomfortable, even if it risks conflict." He nodded. "Good," he said, "because that was the lesson we both needed to learn. Not just how to love each other, but how to be honest with each other, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult." As the evening came to a close, Daniel helped clean up something he hadn't done in years without being asked. The kids gathered their things, tired but happy, and as they prepared to leave, Lily ran back to me, wrapping her arms around my waist. "I love you, Grandma," she said. "I love you too," I replied. And this time, there was no doubt behind those words, no confusion, no hesitation. Just truth. As I stood at the door watching them leave, I felt something settle inside me. Not closure, because life doesn't really work that way, but resolution. A quiet understanding that what had been broken had been rebuilt. Not into what it was before, but into something stronger, something more honest. Because that plate Brittany threw, it didn't just shatter on the floor. It shattered an illusion, an image of family built on silence, assumptions, and unspoken expectations. And in its place, we built something real, something that didn't need to be protected by lies, something that could stand, even when tested. Because in the end, family isn't about perfection. It's about truth. And the courage to face it. Together, there's something I've learned through all of this that I wish more people understood. Not every conflict in a family begins with loud arguments or obvious betrayal. Sometimes it starts quietly, with small assumptions, unspoken expectations, words that aren't said, and truths that aren't questioned. And over time, those small things can grow into something much bigger, something that reshapes how people see each other without anyone realizing it's happening. One of the most dangerous things in any relationship isn't anger. It's silence. Because silence creates space for stories to form stories that may not be true, but feel real enough to believe. I stayed silent when I felt something was off. Daniel stayed silent when things didn't make sense. And in that silence, a false narrative was allowed to grow. A narrative that nearly tore our family apart. But here's the truth. You don't fix a broken relationship by pretending everything is fine. You fix it by facing what's real, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it hurts. And sometimes, healing doesn't mean going back to what things used to be. It means building something new, something stronger, more honest, and more aware. Boundaries aren't about pushing people away. They're about protecting what matters. And love isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about having the courage to face it together. If this story resonated with you, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been misunderstood by someone close to you or felt like you were blamed for something you didn't do? Where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? Share your story in the comments. I read them and you're not alone. And if you believe in stories about truth healing and standing up for yourself with dignity, consider liking this video and subscribing. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to live inside a lie.